Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thank you to Jack and to Kim and Evelyn. I really enjoyed your talks, and I'm thrilled to be part of this panel. As Jack mentioned, I'm in the second year of my PhD, which is a collaborative partnership between Kew Gardens and is supervised by Felix Driver at Royal Holloway. The primary source and impetus of my project is the papers of Lovell Reeve and Co., a leading natural history publisher of books and periodicals in the 19th century, which are now in the archives at Kew. Like Kim and Evelyn, I'm an art historian, but actually this presentation is not particularly art historical. My thesis explores how Lovell Reeve's publications resulted from a complex system of labor and market dynamics, with the publisher working as intermediary and facilitator of illustrators, writers, printers, and scientists to produce volumes that were then consumed by both specialist and lay audiences. In this paper, I will discuss what Lovell Reeve's catalog tells us about 19th century natural history publishing and the ways in which we can combine the data and stories contained in this archive to study publishing as a business and books themselves as material objects. So who was Lovell Reeve? Lovell Reeve was born in 1814, the son of a successful draper. When he was 13, Reeve was apprenticed to Francis Graham, a grocer and tea dealer. Period narratives of Reeve's life often mourn his lack of formal education. However, it was actually this apprenticeship which led Reeve into the world of natural history. Francis Graham was not merely a grocer, but also a dealer of natural history specimens. Reeve himself ventured into this line of work and developed a strong interest in the study of shells. Reeve began working as a publisher through publishing his own monumental work, Conchologia Iconica, beginning in 1843. Over the next 2 decades, Reeve became a prolific publisher of popular and specialist natural history works, building a business that lasted in one form or another for a century after his death in 1865. Lovell Reeve was well established in the network of natural history figures of the time. He became a fellow of the Linnean Society in 1846. However, Reeve was never successful in his goal of getting elected a fellow of the Royal Society, despite receiving Darwin's support for his nomination in 1849. As a naturalist himself and one with an intriguing background and a strong personality, one ongoing question for me is how to strike the right balance between focusing on the biography of him and examining the wider structure of his business and its place in the larger ecosystem of 19th century natural history. Certainly, Reeve's own particular interests shaped what he published. One example of this is that he founded the Stereoscopic magazine and published the first ever book illustrated with stereo photographs. This was driven by Reeve's personal interest in stereography and demonstrates Reeve's engagement with developing technologies of visual culture. As you will see further on in my presentation, even though the business Lovell Reeve far outlived the man, the quantity and creativity of their output changed in the years following his death. It's very revealing to focus on the publisher, particularly during the mid-19th century, when a proliferation of new, more affordable natural history publications sought wider, more popular audiences, including women, children, and the middle class. Correspondence with authors and the negotiation of contracts highlights the difficulty of the transition towards science as a profession with economic expectations for its practitioners, and science publishing as an economic enterprise, not one subsidized by wealthy patrons. Lovell Reeve published a large range of natural history works. You may know them as the publishers of Curtis's Botanical magazine, Bentham's Handbook of the British Flora, and many of William and Joseph Hooker's works. Their publications also included a whole range of popular natural history books aimed at more mainstream audiences, and large and elaborate volumes of hand-colored lithographic illustrations. A single publisher's catalog is a collection shaped over time, not just by their own interests and sensibilities, but by the successes and failures of different publications and the changing desires of the market. Looking at the makeup of Lovell Reeve's publications throughout the 19th century provides clues as to the commercial success of differing publication types. However, in order to really understand the large-scale data that we gain from analyzing Lovell Reeve's price lists and larger catalog, we must also go into the archive. I built my data set of Lovell Reeve's publications from Lovell Reeve's own lists of works, published regularly as price lists and included in the back of numerous books. These price lists included convenient information about price, size, and illustrations. However, it was important that I did not rely solely on these publishers' price lists for my own list of publications, as the price lists largely reflect publications that Lovell Reeve owned outright, or where the author agreed to pay for advertising, an aspect of the publishing contract which proved to be extremely controversial as I began to read Reeve's correspondence with authors. As such, books published on commission, and particularly books paid for by subscribers, might systematically be missing from these lists. In a century of operation, Lovell Reeve published roughly 586 volumes, not including periodicals. This does, however, include serial publications, which I will discuss at greater length later in my presentation. The most active period for the firm is between 1845 and 1880. Unfortunately, this is the period for which we have the fewest archival sources. The business ledgers held at Kew date from the 1880s onwards. However, an outgoing correspondence book covers this period and fortunately includes numerous cost estimates and sales figures, providing an admittedly one-sided view of business operations. Reeve published largely on botany and zoology, with some forays into other scientific disciplines and a few nonfiction books on history and art. The fact that Reeve's publications were botanical by some margin is interesting when we consider that Reeve himself was a conchologist and someone embedded in a network of fellow experts on shells. This botanical leaning likely comes from his close relationship with the Hookers and Kew, but I've yet to identify the exact origins of this relationship or how Reeve became their de facto publisher of choice. Perhaps even more interesting to consider is the distribution of works by publication type. The majority of publications were intended for specialist audiences, like floras, monographs on a single species, and narratives of naval voyages. But a significant 34.3% were explicitly aimed at popular audiences. These popular publications are particularly interesting to me as the publisher had increased influence on their content and production. If we look at the number of popular publications published by year as compared to Reeve's total output, we can see that popular publications came largely in the 1850s and 1860s, petering out as Lovell Reeve's total output also went down in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While it is tempting to make judgments about the market for these publications changing based on this downward trajectory, it's important to consider other factors. In particular, Lovell Reeve himself died in 1865. The firm continued to publish works he had planned to publish for several years afterwards, but beginning in the 1870s, the firm was taking a much more hands-off approach. Reeve's popular publications largely took the form of two series, the Popular Natural History series of the 1850s and the Crown Natural History series, aimed at a slightly more expert audience of the 1860s. Both are characterized by these beautiful publisher trade cloth bindings and had a standardized size, number of plates, and sales price. Works by women make up 12% of Lovell Reeve's total output, but 30% of their popular works. As I will illustrate later, Reeve's correspondence with female authors provides remarkable insight into the challenges faced by female authors and the way their work was perceived by publishers. Another important aspect of Reeve's business model was books published in serial parts or multiple volumes. Publishing in parts to spread production costs over a long period while retaining income from sales is perceived by many as one of the defining characteristics of 19th century publishing. At first glance, the proportion of serial publications out of total individual titles published by Lovell Reeve seems surprisingly small at just 15.7%. However, the true significance of these publications is revealed when we examine serial publications published over time as compared to total annual production. By the last decades of the 19th century, continuing the publication of serials makes up almost the entirety of Lovell Reeve's output. One defining characteristic of Lovell Reeve's publications is their illustration. 72.9% of Reeve's publications were illustrated. Joseph Hooker remarked in a letter to William Henry Harvey regarding the publication of Phycologia Britannica that, as far as the printing in color is concerned, Reeve's has beat any book that I ever saw. Reeve was known for high-quality lithographic illustrations on both a large and a small scale. Reeve had numerous models for the contracts of natural history publishing. An excellent overview of these models is given in his correspondence with Charlotte Chanter, the author of Ferny Combs, a kind of hybrid field guide and travel guide, leading its reader through the coastal towns of Devonshire and instructing the reader on the identification and collection of local ferns. Reeve initially offers to buy the copyright from her for £10. The firm would have then published the book at their own expense and reaped all profits. This was the model used for the popular natural history series, where Reeve paid authors £20 with another £10 if the book reached a second edition. Chanter refused this, presumably unhappy with the low offer and perhaps also insulted that Reeve had insisted that she find a male naturalist to provide an introduction because, as he explains, books on natural history do not sell with the name of a lady only as author. Reeve then explains the two other models he offers for publications. He can publish at her own expense and risk, taking his profit from a 10% commission on sales, or at his own expense and risk, taking a half share of the profit. Chanter presumably selects the second offer, but Chanter and Reeve's disagreements do not end there. Reeve's letters to Chanter are an excellent demonstration of his close involvement in the creation of a publication like Ferny Combs, and the way that the market for natural history books determine their form. Reeve pushes Chanter to produce a more attractive book. Specifically, he suggests the move from woodcut illustrations of Chanter's sketches to colored lithographic plates, many of which he borrows directly from his previous work, Popular History of British Ferns. The reason behind this change is that the simpler woodcut illustrated book would be sold at a cheaper price and would require a sale of more copies to pay the cost of production, while the colored lithographic book could be sold for much more and would pay for itself more quickly. Ultimately, Reeve and Chanter's collaboration proved fruitful, and Chanter was correct to hold on to the copyright for her little book, as Reeve called it, which went on to 3 editions in the midst of the mid-19th century fern craze. However, not all of Reeve's collaborations proved so successful. The relative profitability of different publication types is referred to anecdotally in Reeve's correspondence with his authors. Lovell Reeve today is best known for publications associated with the Hookers and Kew. However, in 1850 correspondence with the artist Walter Fitch, who provided thousands of lithographs for Reeve publications, including Curtis's Botanical magazine, Lovell Reeve complains that Sir William Hooker's works are the most unprofitable in our books, and our dealings with him the most unthankful. Of course, it's important to note that Reeve had a financial incentive to emphasize the poor performance of past publications when negotiating contracts, so his statements must be taken with a grain of salt. However, the sales figures sometimes included in these letters, as well as the significant cost of the elaborate illustrations like the one shown here, suggests there is some merit in Reeve's complaint about the commercial viability of Hooker's books. Another commercially challenging publication type were narratives of naval expeditions. These works were subsidized by the Admiralty, who would provide a grant to cover the publication costs, and then Reeve would publish on a 10% commission. Referring to the narrative of the voyage of the HMS Herald in correspondence with Berthold Seaman in 1857, Reeve wrote that the sale of such works are always very limited. In the case of the narrative of the voyage of the HMS Samarang from 1848, Reeve struggled to sell the final 500 volumes of the first edition and essentially asked the Admiralty themselves to buy them up. The lines between commercially viable and institutionally subsidized publications are interestingly developed in correspondence with Sir Edward Belcher about his 1855 book, The Last of the Arctic Voyages, which he had initially hoped to publish without involvement from the Admiralty, but which Reeve warned was not sufficiently drawn up for popular reading. Ultimately, Reeve was right to avoid taking on the book as a commercial venture, with the associated risks of paying the production costs. Within a year of its publication, he deemed the sale of the work an absolute failure. Of course, not all of Reeve's publications were commercial failures. One of my favorite publications is Episodes of Insect Life. The book is written by a Chetta domestica, or house cricket, in fact, a Miss L.M. Budgeon. It moves through the seasons, educating its reader on the lives of insects through charming fairy tale-like stories. Reeve concedes to Budgeon that the book paid in the long run, indeed going on to multiple editions, and Budgeon published 3 other subsequent works with Reeve. However, even this commercial success came with caveats for Reeve, demonstrating the small margins for the natural history publisher, particularly as more successful publications subsidized less successful ones. With regards to her second publication, March Winds and April Showers, Budgeon took issue with Reeve's offer to pay her £20 for the book, and Reeve defended that he was so little in the habit of giving anything for natural history works, it never occurred to him that the sum he proposed to her would be regarded as trifling. Few publishers give anything for works on natural history. So much has to be laid out on their getting use and their success. So much depends on the publisher's share in the matter. This is a sentiment echoed throughout Reeve's letters to his authors. He frames himself as a businessman with the need to make a profit on his enterprises, but his authors as gentlemen scholars outside of the realm of commerce. Indeed, in a letter to Walter Fitch, he complains about William Hooker's desire for remuneration for revising text for their publication on the Victoria Regia. Reeve writes that few scientific men look for repayment in money for all that it may cost them in artist labor in their pursuits. This attitude is particularly interesting from Reeve, a man who moved in both scientific and commercial circles. Reeve's catalog of publications and his dealing with authors paint the picture of an industry in transition. He seeks to balance the publication of specialist serial works with single volume popular ones, and to create books that were beautiful as well as useful, because these were the books that paid. Understanding Reeve's catalog and the financial motivations behind his publishing strategy will shape the questions I ask as I turn to the material form of the book itself in the next steps of my research. I'm particularly interested in the process of hand coloring lithographic illustrations, a costly and exacting process which often bred conflict between the publisher and the author. This process is documented in the annotated pattern plates also contained in the Lovell Reeve archive. Thank you so much for your time, and I really look forward to any questions on my presentation. Thank you.